Hello, and welcome to today's webcast, Aligning Corporate Targets for Forests, Climate, and Nature, sponsored by the Accountability Framework Initiative. I'm Alex Navarro, Senior Manager of Nature at GreenBiz, and I'm excited to welcome you all to this conversation. Before we begin, I'm going to go through a few housekeeping details. This webcast platform has a number of features that I'll point out for you. As shown on this slide, you can resize and move around the various windows on the platform to optimize your viewing experience. On the bottom of your screen, there's a toolbar with various buttons. You can download the resources from today's webcast by clicking on the button marked Resources. Note this webcast is being recorded, and the recording will be shared with all registrants later today. If you have questions for today's speakers, simply click on the Q&A button and type your questions into the Q&A window that appears. We'll be fielding those later on in this program, but please don't hesitate to ask questions throughout the whole presentation. You can also chat with other attendees at any time by clicking the group chat button. If you want to give that a try now, you can pop in there and share where you're calling in from today and introduce yourself. And finally, feel free to share what you're learning with your social networks by tagging us at GreenBiz. So on to today's discussion. We're navigating the different target setting, accounting, and disclosure initiatives for forest, climate, and nature can be really confusing. So to bring clarity, these initiatives looked to the accountability framework to align their expectations related to deforestation and ecosystem conversion in agricultural and forestry commodity supply chains. Together, they've developed an integrated suite of practical, aligned, and complementary tools and guidance to support companies in setting and achieving sustainability goals. So today, I'm really excited to be talking about a bunch of things, but a few of the key points: how the accountability framework supports companies to achieve ethical supply chains. We'll be talking about a common language for defining and measuring land use change across the greenhouse gas protocol, SBTI flag, and SBTN land targets, and steps your company can take to address deforestation and conversion in its operations, supply chain, and investments. Joining me today, we have an excellent panel of speakers that represent all the initiatives that I just mentioned. We have Leah Sandberg, lead scientist from AFI, Craig Beatty, manager of forest research and strategy with WWF US, Matt Ramlow, research associate at World Resources Institute, Martha Stevenson, senior director of forest research and strategy for WWF US, and me, I introduced myself earlier, Alex Navarro, senior manager of nature for GreenBiz, and I will be moderating the conversation, and I'll also be keeping an eye on the chat and the Q&A and incorporating those throughout. So we're going to kick off with a presentation first to lay down the foundation for today's panel discussion. So I will pass it over to Leah to get us started with a presentation.
Great. Thanks, Alex, and thanks everybody for joining this discussion today. I'm really looking forward to this opportunity to talk about all the work that we're doing at the Accountability Framework Initiative, and really importantly, together with our partners at the Science-Based Targets Initiative, the Science-Based Targets Network, and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, to provide clear and standardized guidance for companies working to address land use and land use change impacts in their agricultural and forestry supply chains. To begin with, I think it's helpful to place this discussion in the context of just how important this topic is for many companies. Land use change is a major driver of climate change, biodiversity loss, and impacts on human rights, especially land and resource rights. Land use change alone accounts for more than 10% of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions and drives about a third of biodiversity loss globally. For companies that produce or source agricultural or forestry commodities, eliminating land use change in operations and supply chains is likely the single most important thing they can do to meet their climate and nature goals. How land is managed also adds up to a significant amount of emissions and has an even greater impact on biodiversity through other drivers such as pollution, overexploitation, and introduction of invasive species. As companies look for ways to address these impacts within their supply chains, our initiatives have met that need by providing guidance on how to effectively set targets and account for land use and land use change associated with agricultural and forestry commodity production and trade. I'm going to provide a quick snapshot of each of these initiatives and then identify some of the ways in which we have standardized our expectations for companies. So today, these are the initiatives that we're going to discuss: the Accountability Framework Initiative, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and the Science-Based Targets Network. Together, these initiatives guide companies to do two things. These four initiatives seek to address different pieces of this huge land sector puzzle, and there's understandably confusion and concern about how they relate. But in fact, each of these adds to and builds upon the others. Together, these initiatives guide companies to do two things: to set targets to reduce land sector impacts and to account for the impacts currently in their operations and supply chains. It's got this table up here. These actions are aligned across efforts to achieve deforestation and conversion-free supply chains on this first row, to reduce land sector emissions, to achieve climate goals, and to support nature. So the accountability framework, as you can see, provides guidance on targets and accounting to eliminate deforestation and ecosystem conversion in supply chains, focusing on the land use change wedge of that pie we saw earlier. The SBTI includes that goal, but also addresses other sources of emissions, as well as carbon removals from land management. And the Greenhouse Gas Protocol supports that accounting. The Science-Based Targets Network, land targets, place those company actions in a broader frame that looks beyond carbon to the other services that land provides. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how each of these initiatives work to guide companies towards their target setting and their accounting. So the accountability framework is a consensus-based guide for achieving agricultural and forestry supply chains that are free of deforestation, conversion of other natural ecosystems, and human rights abuses. It provides agreed-upon principles, detailed operational guidance, and common definitions across 7 key company actions, including setting targets, managing supply chains, monitoring, and disclosure. The framework can be used by companies at all stages of commodity supply chains and at all steps in their sustainability journey to guide effective and timely action. More than anything else, the framework provides a common language and set of expectations around these topics. What is a forest? How do we know when it's been cut down? How should companies manage their supply chains to achieve these goals? The framework is developed and supported by the Accountability Framework Initiative, a coalition of about 25 organizations working collaboratively to accelerate progress for commodity supply chains that protect forests, natural ecosystems, and human rights. While many companies use the framework directly in the development of their policies and their actions, a primary objective of our work is to use the framework as the basis for standardization of expectations across the environment in which companies operate, so that companies are being asked for the same things in the same way by their buyers, their investors, civil society, and other stakeholders. Over the past few years, standardized approaches to defining and assessing deforestation and ecosystem conversion have been incorporated into responsible production standards, traceability and monitoring tools, the policies of industry groups, the methodologies of disclosure and reporting platforms and assessment tools, and relevant for today's discussion, emissions accounting and target setting initiatives. In the emissions accounting space, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol establishes comprehensive global methodologies to measure and manage emissions. Their land sector and removals guidance provides best practice in accounting for greenhouse gas emissions from land use change and land management, as well as carbon dioxide removals in corporate greenhouse gas inventories. This guidance fills a huge gap for companies in food, agriculture, and forestry sectors. For example, the global food system, more than 2/3 of emissions throughout product life cycles are from the land sector, land use change and land management, as seen here. While activities that were found in previous inventory accounting standards, such as processing and transport, make up less than 1/3 of food systems emissions. Using that accounting guidance, the Science-Based Targets Initiative enables companies to set emissions reduction targets that show just how much and how quickly they need to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions to prevent the worst effects of climate change. The SBTI forest, land, and agriculture targets provide the ability for companies to set targets that include emissions that come from land use and land use change, as well as to account for carbon storage and removals that they may be associated with. And as we've seen in sort of all of the various pies that I've shown, this is a really large slice of those emissions that was not included in previous emissions reduction targets. In alignment with the accountability framework, land use change addressed in flag target setting includes deforestation, as well as conversion of peatlands, grasslands, wetlands, and other ecosystems. And finally, the Science-Based Targets Network adds to emissions targets by considering other planetary boundaries besides climate, such as those related to oceans, freshwater, and biodiversity. Their land targets include a no ecosystem conversion target, fully aligned with the framework, as well as targets for land footprint reduction and landscape engagement. These targets are developed and supported by a broad network of organizations, as seen here. So now that we've put each of these pieces in context, I want to talk in more detail about the standardization work we've done together across these initiatives. I'm going to discuss 4 key areas of alignment: definitions, targets, data, and boundaries. First, definitions. As I mentioned, a primary offering of the accountability framework is consensus-based definitions of forest, deforestation, ecosystem conversion, and other terms. All of the initiatives being discussed today use the framework's definitions, ensuring that land use change can be measured and addressed consistently across all of these ways of acting. For example, this matrix, which is found in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol's guidance, shows transitions that are considered by all our initiatives to be deforestation or conversion, and thus to carry land use change emissions. They're in yellow here on the matrix. These include things like conversions from forest to pasture, from grassland to cropland, as well as from natural forest to plantations. The second area of alignment is on targets. All of our initiatives set expectations that all deforestation and conversion should be eliminated from commodity supply chains by between 2025 and 2030, depending on the commodity, type of ecosystem, and location in the supply chain. SBTI flag, for example, while indicating that all ecosystem conversion must be eliminated by 2030 to meet 1.5 degree targets, also requires that companies set a commitment to eliminate deforestation and primary deforestation-linked commodities by 2025, balancing the need for urgency of reducing the largest pools of land use change emissions with the need for time to deal with complex supply chains and less well-understood ecosystems. Third is alignment on data and traceability. The same data on land use change collected along a supply chain at the level of the farm or at the level of a sourcing area can be used to account for both deforestation and conversion for the AFI and the Science-Based Targets Network land targets, as well as for land use change emissions through SBTI and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. This includes remote sensing data, farm level location data, information about deforestation and conversion risk. All the information you're collecting from your suppliers, from your monitoring tools can be used to provide information that supports all of these accounting and target setting mechanisms. And finally, boundaries and scope of a company's impact and responsibility are considered in a parallel way across all of these tools. Each initiative provides guidance on action for direct operations and supply chains, as well as action beyond supply chains. The AFI and the SPTN address ecosystem conversion in operations, supply chains, and sourcing landscapes. SBTI addresses land sector emissions in operations and supply chains as part of their flag guidance, and outside of supply chains in its guidance on beyond value chain mitigation. And the Greenhouse Gas Protocol provides accounting guidance for all of these scopes of impact. I think that's my last slide. I hope that this overview provides an overview of the ways in which these tools can be used together to support ambitious corporate action. My colleagues here can give you a lot more information about each of the initiatives that they work on, so I'm really excited to turn it over to them as we move into our panel discussion. Back to you, Alex.
Thanks so much, Leah. So we're going to move into panel discussion now. I have a few questions prepared that I'm going to ask the speakers just to set the stage, but I'll be incorporating questions from the audience throughout the panel discussion. So please, anything that's coming up for you, feel free to drop in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible. All right. So panelists, you can unmute yourselves if you're not yet. I want to start with two high-level questions that are probably on everyone's mind, just to do some level setting. So how does this all relate to the EU deforestation regulations, or EUDR, and also the disclosure recommendations from TNFD, or the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures? So Leah, I will ask you to address EUDR, and then Craig, if you could address TNFD, that would be great.
Sure. Thanks, Alex. So the EU Deforestation Regulation, or EUDR, is a regulation that was passed last year by the European Union. I'm sure most of you are familiar with it. For several of the most important forest risk commodities, it requires that in order to place products on the EU market, companies must demonstrate that these products are not associated with deforestation after 2020. The EUDR is highly aligned with the accountability framework in terms of its criteria for defining a forest and demonstrating that products are deforestation-free, which means that companies can follow the framework to help ensure compliance with EUDR on a sustained basis. It also means that products that are achieved and demonstrated under the EUDR to be D-free contribute to companies' broader no deforestation, emissions reductions, and nature targets in the ways that we've just described. However, I think it's important to note that EUDR is really just one slice of a larger whole. It applies only to products sold into the EU, only for certain commodities. It looks only at forests and not other ecosystems, and it looks only at product level compliance, not action at the corporate level or across supply chains. So even as companies understandably are really focused on the EUDR right now, it's important to look, I think, beyond those product volume compliance at the more comprehensive targets that we're discussing today if companies are really going to sort of achieve that transformation across their supply chains that's needed to meet these goals.
All right, great. I'll jump in on TNFD here. Thanks, Alex, and lovely to be on a panel of such wonderful people. So I'm always happy to talk about the alignment between TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, and Science-Based Targets Network. So both of these organizations share the same vision. So we're looking to transform business models towards nature-positive economies, right? Based on the best available science. TNFD does that in a way around risks and disclosure. SBTN does that in a target setting component. So at SBTN, we're equipping companies with the guidance to set science-based targets for nature. And TNFD, in turn, is really working to create a framework for companies and financial institutions to manage and disclose their nature-related risks. So SBTN and TNFD are working actively together to ensure alignment in the way that those nature-related risks are understood, how they're framed, and how they're addressed by companies and financial institutions so that they can incorporate nature into their decision-making processes in the most impactful and really efficient ways. One key output of that collaboration is SBTN and TNFD developed joint target setting guidance that was published in September last year, 2023, and I can pop that in the chat if anyone would like to see it. Otherwise, this week, TNFD announced the 320 companies that have signaled their intention to start publishing their nature-related financial disclosures using the TNFD framework, and I would expect that many of the companies that are part of that list would take TNFD's recommendation of the Science-Based Targets Network as the best way to address many of the risks and opportunities that arise from that disclosure process. Thanks.
Great. Thank you both for connecting those dots for us. So I want to dive in now to some of the more practical questions about how we can use some of these streamlined initiatives and talk a little bit about data, which I see coming up quite a bit in the chat here. So first question for Matt and Leah, if you want to jump in as well. What types of data do companies need to estimate deforestation-free supply chains and land use change emissions? Are they similar or different? And I'll have a follow-up about what to do in cases where companies might not be able to get all of that data. So first, what are the types of data that we're looking for? Matt, if you want to kick us off with that.
Happy to kick it off. So again, Matt Ramlo, I'm with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and we've worked closely with the Accountability Framework to align some of the approaches that we use when it comes to companies estimating land use change emissions within their greenhouse gas inventories. And for those of you who might not be familiar, many of the land use change conversions, as Leah presented, are very similar to the reporting on deforestation. So the first piece of it is that both of these frameworks allow for flexibility in the traceability data that companies have. We've learned from a lot of our pilots that while traceability is improving for certain commodity supply chains, sometimes it's lacking currently. So we do allow for different levels of traceability over time, and that's one that is consistent across both. In terms of some of the specific data that's required, it depends on what level of traceability a company has, and there's different metrics that companies can use if they only have traceability to a country of origin for land use change emissions accounting, where they then have to take a share of the broader land use change that's occurring within that country based on the commodities that are present. But when they do have traceability to producers or specific sourcing regions, the types of data that are needed is when does the land use change occur within those areas that they're sourcing from, having hectares or polygons for the farms or plantations that they're sourcing from, so that they can compare that to when deforestation occurred. When it comes to AFI accounting, that's often reported on a hectare basis. When it comes to greenhouse gas reporting, it's reported on a CO2 equivalent basis. So in order to get to the CO2 equivalent, you also need some information on carbon stocks before and after conversion, along with other greenhouse gas emissions associated with conversion, such as biomass burning. But again, a lot of the way that we've structured this is that companies can build monitoring systems that are able to speak to both of these hectare metrics and greenhouse gas metrics in the same framework.
Great. And Matt or any other panelists, do you want to talk a little bit more about what companies should do if they're unable to get certain data from their supply chains? Where should they be focusing their efforts? What should they be prioritizing first?
Sure, I can take that one first. So from the greenhouse gas emissions side of things, if we look at a lot of corporate accounting currently, it is largely based on secondary databases that are out there. So what we often encourage companies who are newer to the process to just really understand their entire inventory and to try to complete a complete greenhouse gas inventory that covers all of the relevant sources of emissions within their value chain. What that means could be going into some of these databases and trying to determine what are some of those key areas within our 15 categories of scope 3 emissions. And many of those for consumer goods companies, for food and beverage companies, often do show up within the land sector in some of these land use change emissions and land management emissions that we're talking about. So I think sometimes using secondary databases to try to identify those hot spots and to understand where the biggest source of emissions are within your value chain is a good place to start. And then once you have those priorities area, really trying to delve in and understand how can you improve traceability, whether that's through collecting data directly from your suppliers or looking to other partnerships within your value chain, depending on your location within the value chain. So using that kind of hotspot analysis can be a really important tool to really know where you want to target not only further data, but also climate action, mitigation actions to reduce your impact.
Great, thank you.
Following up, sorry, I can jump in here on because kind of where the process for greenhouse gas protocol and understanding land use change and prioritization for carbon is we kind of fold that into SBTN, so companies can understand in their land target setting and utilize the methods and tools developed by the greenhouse gas protocol to understand land use change in a nature context. Within SBTN, we go through a very similar prioritization process where companies understand their materiality to different pressures related to nature in our steps 1 and 2, and then go through a similar prioritization process to understand where they have the most impacts on nature and what commodities and regions would be associated with those for freshwater and land targets. Thank you.
Great. Does anybody else want to add to that?
I can maybe
All
just
right.
jump in briefly. Oh, sorry. To add that,
Go for it.
for downstream companies, creating and building systems that allow you to get more information more accurately, more quickly from your suppliers and their suppliers is not just useful for target setting across sort of our three organizations, but also for all sorts of other mechanisms, whether that's EUDR, whether that's your human rights commitments and policies. The more that you understand your supply chain, the more that you can sort of do all of the things that you need to do, both from a sustainability perspective, as well as sort of all the other objectives of your company. So, if you don't yet have farm level data, that's fine, that's normal. But sort of saying, how do we understand where the risks in our supply chain lie? How can we build better relationships with those suppliers or find suppliers who can better provide us this information in those landscapes to get the information you need to better assess what's happening on the ground, whether that's land use change, whether that's human rights issues. So really, I think the move towards understanding supply chains is one that's happening, very exponentially increasing right now. And hopefully that gets to, some of our downstream companies. I think right now there's a lot of change happening there. And as far as, understanding impacts on the ground, from the accountability framework side, where we say, you need enough information to understand whether deforestation and conversion is happening. And that can look like a lot of different things. It can look like you've got these polygons and you go on the ground and walk the boundary. It means that you can use remote sensing tools. Maybe it means that you have this prioritization of your sourcing areas and you're understanding which ones don't really carry deforestation risk and which ones do. And that's the stage you're at right now. And then you're working from there. So, really understanding what can we say is deforestation and conversion free and how do we know it? And then how do we sort of tackle the next group that we don't know is really where I think everybody's at right now.
Thanks, Leah. I have a question in the chat here that I think would be good for Martha. So kind of continuing with quantifying emissions, collecting data, separating flag and non-flag emissions in supply chains can be challenging. Do you foresee standardized tools to help with these emissions quantifications? So Martha, are there tools that exist for that, or do you see them coming down the pipeline?
Yeah, so this is a great question and something we've been doing a lot of outreach on with the various databases that provide information to companies and consultants in order to develop these baselines and targets. As Leah outlined in her presentation, a lot of these emissions, particularly from land use change and land management, the carbon emissions from those processes had not previously been tracked or reported. So for a lot of this, it's kind of gathering that inventory data per the greenhouse gas guidelines for the first time. And so a lot of the historic databases actually didn't include those emissions either. Some of them did, most of them didn't. And so there's a big effort right now to kind of work through a lot of these reference data sets to include those carbon emissions within these data sets to make sure that they are present. And we've even heard from several of the large database owners that they have now a separate flag portion of their database to make sure that companies can see the differentiation between the emissions that you would include in your flag target and then your energy and industries target. So I think this is one of those instances where the data infrastructure wasn't in place when we released the guidance, but as soon as it was seen what is needed, the market quickly reacts to then produce the necessary data infrastructure in order to enable companies to set these kinds of targets for the first time. So I think we've seen, even the past year, a real evolution in this space. And I think as we keep going, it's just going to get better and better. This is the first time we're measuring these emissions. It's going to, I keep saying we need to give ourselves grace, but I've been really pleased and surprised at how quickly some of these databases have moved already. So really exciting.
Thank you. I have a follow-up question here for Leah, but I think several of you might be able to add to this as well. Can you provide examples of systems that will help collect farm-level data that Leah mentioned earlier? Leah, I'll start with you, but if anyone else has
Sure.
anything to add, feel free to chime
Yeah,
in.
I mean, I think it is not going to be anything magical that people haven't already heard of, but increasingly there are really good remote sensing tools, both publicly available and organized by or by companies that sort of work on a fee for service basis, that can provide very high quality, high resolution remote sensing data looking at land use change over time. So that's really something that is increasingly available, especially in sort of these commodity hotspots that we are really looking at for commodity driven land use change. So I think, understanding what data is publicly available, for example, through things like Global Forest Watch, and then working with service providers to get a better handle on, areas of interest in your own supply chain that might be a little trickier to see. The data are getting really, really good. It's just a question of organizing them and understanding them, and it's a lot to take in. But so I think the stages are, first try to understand, the traceability piece needs to come first. Where is your material coming from to the best of your ability to understand, and then how can you increase your understanding of where the material is coming from, and then what tools or products are available to help monitor land use change in that region. There's different regional products, and for the ecosystems that are relevant for you. So it's really just a question of figuring out where you're looking and then what tools are the best ones available for doing that. At the risk assessment stage, there's a number of companies that sort of do the risk assessment work, and then at the monitoring stage, there's a number of different data sets and organizations that do the monitoring work. So that's really, to some extent where it's at. I think, things like UDR are pushing everybody towards a better understanding of actual farm level data to getting geolocation. I think that's going to be moving that ability to do that quickly at the farm level very quickly as well.
Great. Craig, do you want to chime in from the SBTN angle on this?
Yeah, because this is a question that comes up a lot. We're working through the pilot process right now for SBTN land targets. And one of the things that we've done in our no conversion target is to delineate the data requirements that companies need based on different stages in the value chain. So we are always happy for companies to have farm level or plot level data or production unit data, and if that traceability is available, it goes a long way in being able to calculate a no conversion target. But we divide up our value chain into kind of company producers or direct operations to the first points of aggregation for different regional and global conversion driving commodities, and then for sourcing that is kind of beyond, like downstream of the first point of aggregation. And so we would certainly recognize that for a lot of companies, having that farm level data on land conversion or that plot level data on land conversion is not something that's available. And so in that context, we certainly point to the way that the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and SBTI flag work to calculate statistical land use change at a subnational level. And there's guidance in our existing, an annex in our existing guidance that outlines how companies can deal with not having production unit or farm level data, but still work on setting targets for nature.
Great, thank you. We've got some really great questions coming up here. There are two in particular I think are just very practical, so I'll try to pair them together. Carolyn asked, where would we find the standardized questions we should be asking our suppliers on land use change? And then Marissa asked, in the short term, like next 1 to 2 years, is there a recommended cadence that's easiest for companies in terms of setting a flag target and setting an SBTN deforestation and conversion target? How much work will a company need to do to meet the qualifications for SBTN target? One, if they've already set a flag target. So feel free to take those in either order.
I'll take the first one on. Maybe you can read it again so I can remember exactly what it was, but it's a quick one, and then I can turn it over to Martha and Craig for the rest.
Yeah. Where can they find standardized questions they should be asking suppliers on land use change?
Excellent. So this is really a big piece of what we do with the Accountability Framework Initiative, which is to really standardize the the ways that companies are going to be asked for this information. So there's a couple of places that I would recommend thinking about this. And one is we have a document. It's called the Common Methodology for Reporting and Assessment. Maybe I'll drop the link in the chat at some point. That is on our AFI website, Accountability Framework website, that provides a menu. It's not intended to be used in its entirety, but provides a menu of metrics that have been agreed upon by all of our reporting and assessment partners as being sort of the best available metrics to assess all of the actions within the scope of the accountability framework, from target setting, risk assessment, DCF progress, monitoring, et cetera. So that document can be found on our website. It provides an incredible resource for building assessments and things like that. We also already integrated a lot of these, or all of these metrics, into existing reporting and assessment platforms. So for example, the CDP Forest questionnaire is fully aligned with our metric list. So that is a great place to say, we're asking our suppliers these questions. Can we make sure we're asking them in a way that's aligned with CDP, so that, if they're doing their CDP reporting, they already have this information on hand, it can give it to us. For example, we've worked with the Consumer Goods Forum Forest Positive Coalition to ensure that all of their KPIs for their companies are aligned with those questions. We've worked with organizations like 3Keel and ProForest to ensure that the palm supplier assessments used by their company partners are aligned. So I think there's a lot of different places to look at to see where these questions are.
Yeah, I'm happy to kick us off on the second question. So where to start in the next 1 to 2 years if you're a company? Obviously, because the flag guidance is final and published, I'd recommend starting there. Right now, the SBTN targets are in piloting with 17 companies right now, and the first version hasn't been formally released. There will be some refinements and changes through the piloting program. So flags available. I think I've seen in the chat mention of when is the greenhouse gas protocol land sector and removals guidance going to be published. So obviously that's something that will fully complete the flag suite when it's pulled together. And hopefully soon I'll let Matt answer those questions. But there are a number of other guidance documents that are listed within flag that you can use the draft greenhouse gas protocol as is, or you can use other ISO standards or other guidance that have been issued kind of in the place of having this final guidance in order to do your first inventory to submit your flag target. So you could do that inventory and submit. We've had 15 to 20 companies already have approved flag targets. So I'd recommend starting there. And as Leah said, you part of the first step of really mapping your land use change and will be understanding the activity data, the commodities that are most associated with land use change as part of your flag target. And then that maps directly to the SBTN target 1. But you'll see as where we have a kind of hard requirement on deforestation targets and a recommendation around conversion of other ecosystems, the nature framework under SBTN has kind of very specific timelines that you want to meet with regard to conversion of other ecosystems based on their proximity or overlap with key biodiversity areas, and also what type of commodity it is and your relationship to that commodity. So it gets into the weeds quickly, so we won't take you there now. But just to say there's direct overlap, I would start with flag, and then it's a very easy map on to SBTN.
Great. Matt, did you want to follow up to talk about when final guidance will be released?
Yeah, so for those of you on the call today who might not be familiar, Greenhouse Gas Protocol has been developing our guidance over the past 4 years now. In September of 2022, we released our draft that's currently available on our website that you can all find. And that went under public review and pilot testing. We're currently in the final stages, discussing through our stakeholder process, the final set of guidance. So our plan is to publish by the end of the year, and then we are looking to try to do some type of communications publicly on what the final set of requirements will be later this year. So if you're interested, I'd encourage you to go to our website and sign up for our newsletter, and you'll get more information on when those dates will be released.
Thank you. So I'm seeing quite a few questions related to essentially how do these guidelines trickle down to the farmer? How are smallholder farmers impacted? Let's say if they have deforested some of their land for agriculture, are they just excluded from the supply chain? What happens to them? Would someone be able to speak a little bit to that?
Start off, and anyone else is welcome to jump in. This is a really good question. The accountability framework provides, really sort of clear guidance that smallholder inclusion is a priority in many supply chains. It's necessary for, human well-being and economic development in many of these countries. So a lot of the expectations of the framework, are really recommended to be balanced with considerations of smallholder inclusion. We have a guidance document on smallholder inclusion, describing some ways that some of these expectations can be nuanced for a smallholder context. For example, we really strongly recommend engaging with smallholders that are in groups or co-ops that have internal governance already to guide action and activity, and then sort of looking at compliance mechanisms that can be looked at across all of those groups, so that you're not sort of having to sort of nix individual farms because they might have had conversion on it. Can you say, does this group have places, systems in place to prevent conversion by its members, et cetera? So I think that's a really good way to try to promote inclusion without having to sort of go down and look at conversion on every 2-hectare farm. We also I think have a lot of focus on landscape initiatives and jurisdictional initiatives, which say that, in order to secure a sort of deforestation-free supply chain, you're going to need to look at other suppliers besides your own, because smallholder supply chains are incredibly dynamic. You don't know in any given year which smallholders you're actually buying from, in a region. So if you can be collaborating with peer companies in that space to provide support and incentives for those farmers to avoid land use change, then it not only transforms that region into a region that becomes much lower risk and allows you to source the commodities you need, but allows those smallholders to continue to engage in your supply chain. So it's definitely a really tricky balance that I think a combination of sort of collaborative engagement at the landscape level, and then really understanding how you're monitoring and managing compliance are sort of two key aspects of that.
Anybody want to add to that?
Happy to jump in here on the SBTI side. So for FLAG, I did see a question asking if smallholders could set targets, and the answer is yes, but they wouldn't need to use the FLAG framework necessarily. There is a separate pathway within SBTI for small to medium-sized enterprises with very clear definitions of what that entails. And setting a target under that pathway is much more simplified than some of the kind of more onerous processes about, deep detailed inventories and, levels of assurance, et cetera. And so it's a much more streamlined process for SMEs. And so any, smallholder farmer, if they wanted to set a target, that's what they would use. In terms of how does this trickle down and impact the smallholders within SBTI, it's really a target setting tool. We want to make sure we're matching corporate ambition with with the future pathways that will achieve 1.5. I think maybe the first thing to know is in the modeling of these pathways, we choose the subset of IPCC pathways that align with the Sustainable Development Goals. So there are pathways within the IPCC that they model that get to 1.5 that do not result in kind of water, energy access for all, right? And so we kind of don't use those in the models. And so when we're setting these targets, we only use those ones aligning with the SDGs. And then for the FLAG guidance, because this is so critical, we added a section on some implementation guidance pointing to other organizations and detailed guidance on how to really make sure that you're going through, FPIC processes, free prior informed consent, when working with smallholders and landholders, making sure you are respecting the land and carbon rights of these individuals, making sure that you're informing them of their carbon rights, because a lot of people don't know about this. And so we've detailed guidance out in that section. As you are trying to implement your target and working through your supply chain, what are some of the best practices and other guidance documents that you could use in order to guide that process? So that's how we've handled it within FLAG.
Thanks. Matt or Craig, want to add anything to that?
Sure, I can. I mean, I saw in the chat somebody talk about the SBTN's third land target, which is on landscape engagement. And I think really to get to the question of like, how do these targets impact farm level decisions? Our no conversion target uses a natural lands map so companies can understand what was natural in 2020 and then set a target for no conversion by the differentiated target dates based on commodity and place in the value chain. So that takes care of the kind of avoidance of those impacts of converting natural land. That is always paired with a company's engagement in a landscape scale initiative that's material to them. And so as a company engages, that landscape scale initiative needs to meet certain criteria. And part of that criteria is that it's a stakeholder-led process and the company would engage in it. So at a landscape scale, we would hope that as companies engage in those initiatives, that part of the stakeholder groups that compose that initiative are tuned into what the conditions are in a specific place and how that impacts both people and nature.
And real quick, I can maybe just echo a lot of what has been said already around for greenhouse gas protocol. Our general approach is to allow for flexibility on how companies are going to do the accounting. So that would be flexibility to account at some of these larger jurisdictional scales to engage at that level. I think we heard from a lot of our pilots as we went through this process, various strategies for how they were going to try to tackle land use change emissions or other land management emissions. And while some do direct engagement with individual suppliers, a lot of them see more potential within some of the landscape scale approaches. So we've tried to build an accounting framework that account for both. The one that I will say where we do require some additional data that often does require engagement with the landowners to understand the types of mitigation practices that are taking place would be on the CO2 removals front. So that often does require some additional data quality and would encourage companies to really just have better information on what is actually occurring on the landscape, and that may require further engagement with individual producers in order to really understand the level of CO2 removals that are occurring from different types of practices. So.
Great. So I have a question here regarding companies in the mining and mineral sector, but I think more broadly, they're referring to folks who are outside of the agricultural and forestry related products sectors. So when they're working through this, are there other tools or resources that they can be using or insights to take from food and forestry sectors as they're working through the flag guidance? Or if that's outside of the scope of this, also okay, but I've gotten a few questions about different kinds of commodities.
Yeah, I mean, any land use, if you're doing a full greenhouse gas inventory, any land use change, no matter the driver, should be included within your inventory and can be included in your regular SBTI target. You don't have to set a separate flag target for it. Particularly if it's lower than 20% of your overall emissions profile, then you absolutely wouldn't need to set a flag target. It would be part of your regular target. But so I think it's just in terms of inventory completeness, you would want to include whether it's building expansion, extractives like mining, any land use change that you're causing, you would want to make sure that those emissions are within your inventory. And then you would reduce those emissions in line with the kind of energy and industry sector pathway. Is that good enough? Does that answer?
I think so. Thank you.
I would just add that we had specific cases of those within our pilots as well. So very much some of those industries are engaged and they can leverage a lot of the same data and tools that are out there to do some of the analysis for food. So much of that information is already readily available through existing data sets. It's just either having those technical capacity within your own team or looking to some of these other groups that are out there to help support and doing that assessment.
Great. So we've got probably time for one more question, and I want to kind of pull it all together. If there was one bit of advice that you'd share with companies that are starting to prioritize this work, what's that one piece of advice that you would give them for moving forward? And maybe we could go through everyone. We'll start with Craig.
Maybe my best piece of advice would be keep calm and work with what you have, right? We're right at the edge of sustainability. If it's for nature, especially. I mean, if you ask any of the other three panelists here, you know, they've been working on greenhouse gas protocols, been around for a long time. SBTI has been chugging along for a good time. For nature, we're just getting started. So keep calm, work to understand the areas that your commodities, especially those that drive regional and global conversion of natural ecosystems, come from, and help us to drive the ambition and match the feasibility that we're looking for in science-based targets for nature. I'll throw it over to Leah, maybe.
Thanks. I would say that, you know, especially for companies that are sourcing agricultural or forestry products, you know, food, consumer goods, retail, paper packaging, I really always come back to address understanding the land use change in your supply chain and starting right now, today, to reduce it is the single most important thing that you can do. You know, even if GHG protocol is still being finalized, even if EUDR is writing its final rules, like none of that affects the fact that the more and the faster you can be reducing land use change in your supply chain, the better off that you're going to be for all of these goals and targets. It's going to set you up to meet your flag targets. It's going to set you up to meet your nature targets. It's going to set you up to be EUDR compliant. Probably other things that we haven't even invented yet that are going to be asked down the road because, you know, we are, you know, trying our best to figure out the right ways to, you know, protect the planet. Really, there's no need to wait until all of the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed to know that that is something that needs to happen. So don't wait, start right now. If you don't understand the land use change in your supply chain, understand it. If you understand it, figure out, you know, the first thing you can do to start reducing it. It's definitely like a no loss thing you can be doing.
Thanks. Martha?
Yeah, I'll pile on with a yes and. So all of the things that Craig and Leah said, I think, you know, prioritize on what's big and get started on that. But I think a lens that I've really seen catalyze impressive action from companies is when, not just in impact assessment, but when they really start to understand the places that they're sourcing from, their dependence on some of these places. Maybe a commodity, a critical commodity in your supply chain has a limited geographic range within which it can be produced. Really understanding those relationships, I think, can help both help you move a little bit faster maybe towards some of these critical areas, but also just help build it into brand identity and corporate action in a way that when it's just kind of, you know, hammering away at impact, maybe doesn't have as much passion or purpose behind it. So I do think taking a moment to really understand your relationship to these places and the environment can help catalyze action in a really fun and invigorating way. So I would just say, as you're assessing impact, also make sure that you're really building or deepening your relationship with these places. Matt, final word.
I guess to maybe close it out, I would certainly start from the same place that everyone else has been recommending, of really trying to understand your supply chain and where your biggest impact area. But I guess the one thing that I would add to some of the great recommendations would be looking to partnerships. I think one of the things that's come out a lot of our pilots is the important role that some of these supply chain coalitions are going to play, not only partnering with some of who you're sourcing from, but also thinking about some of these collaborations with other initiatives and programs and data providers. We see this space is evolving very rapidly. There are lots of people who are really engaged on a lot of these issues, and a lot of really smart people out there who are looking to build these types of programs and partnerships moving forward. So I would just say you're not in this alone. There's a lot of other people who have very similar objectives, and I think that there's a lot of potential for where some of these might go in the future.
Great. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much to our speakers for a great conversation and taking this pretty complex topic and making it, I think, pretty digestible. So thank you so much for that. And thanks to Sydney, who's my colleague behind the scenes, for making everything run so smoothly. If you'd like to rewatch this webcast, the recording will be archived on greenbiz.com, and our team will email you the link once it's available later today. You can also check out the resources on this topic by clicking on the resource button on your screen. That will include the webcast slides, the PDF for deforestation and conversion-free supply chains and land use change emissions, and a link to register for GreenBiz 24, which is our premier annual event for sustainable business leaders coming up in just a few weeks in Phoenix, Arizona. Lastly, if you'd like to watch more GreenBiz webcasts, please visit greenbiz.com/webcasts. And on behalf of my colleagues at GreenBiz and our speakers today, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Alex Navarro. I hope you have a great day, and maybe I'll see you next month in Phoenix at GreenBiz 24.